Hi, I'm still Alan Pizarski. In my description of my creds this time, let me say that for the last 5 reauthorizations, I have prepared the state DOTs, AASHTO's, and the 50 states' investment requirements in national legislation. Again, it was something I'm going to keep at until I get it right. You heard my goal before, so I don't have to repeat it, so let's get right into it. Today, all the talk is about finance in Washington and everywhere else, and I can go into a whole bunch of reasons why we're really focused on finance, and obviously things are not good. When we talk about finance, as I mentioned earlier, you begin to recognize that you really have to have a menu. You have to have an agenda for the public. You can't just say, trust me. And so more and more there's an agenda produced. If you give me this money, this is what we will do. And so that kind of makes some sense. So we have a plan that kind of feeds that finance. And then you say, well, in order to have a plan, you really need a vision. And I mentioned vision before, and that's the nonce word today. Everybody's focused on vision. AASHTO just finished a retreat with all of the major associations. We have the Congress holding sessions. The 2 commissions are talking about vision. And of course, vision doesn't pay or doesn't matter much unless the person with the vision, the group with the vision, has some credibility. So I think that what we're in today is this sequence of credibility to vision to plan to finance. And very different than making this argument on grounds of economic theory, rather based on this kind of structure. I want to go back and talk a little bit about the history of the interstate and kind of build a little bit of a parallel. Some of you noticed yesterday I was wearing my Interstate at 50 t-shirt, a sweatshirt, when we crossed the United States commemorating the 50th anniversary of the interstate, and it was just a great process. If you go back and look, and I'm now talking in the 1930s, the credibility of the feds, Thomas McDonald, Herbert Fairbank, Frank Turner, was incredible. I mean, I read legislative hearings in the 30s where the chairman would look at the other members after they were all fighting over something, and he'd say, well, why don't we just leave it to Chief McDonald and he'll let us know what the answer is? And they'd all say, swell. Believe me, that doesn't happen now. That credibility led to a marvelous vision, and that's expressed in a book called Toll Roads and Free Roads, not Toll Roads or Free Roads, Toll Roads and Free Roads, that was produced in the 30s. Superb piece of work. Everybody should go back and really take a look at it. Really the first nationally important book, I think, in our national history. And that led to a plan called Interregional Highways, another superb book, both of them written by Fairbank. Absolutely marvelous pieces of erudition and the ability to write that today we don't have. This is produced in 1944 as we're moving towards the end of World War II. And then finally what we celebrate in the 50th anniversary of the interstate is actually the 50th anniversary of the financing plan. The interstate design was around since 44. So it was the financing that was of interest at that point in 56. So the key point here is that it took 20 years to go from vision to finance, and that's kind of what it takes, and probably take a whole lot longer today because you got more people shooting at you as you go. This is a photo of the Clay Commission handing President Eisenhower their report on how to finance the system, and I've circled Frank Turner there, kind of the patron saint of the highway program. This is Frank 40 years later, in 1996, celebrating the 40th anniversary with some unknown person. If you notice, I'm actually trying to hide my glass of wine there. This was a splendid event. This was the 40th anniversary of the interstate, as you can see, right in front of the White House. Frank Al Gore Sr. received awards, and several other folks. The thing we're leaning on, by the way, is the National Zero Milestone Marker, from which Eisenhower started in 1917 on the national trek across the country. This is a 3-dimensional document mapping from 1944. And I have no idea how maybe that's lemon meringue, I don't know what it is. I mean, but this is this is national network data from 19, you know, of course they had all those big computers back then, which we don't have now. That's probably, I honestly don't know how they did it. But my point is that the effectiveness of the reporting and the thinking that went into these documents is just absolutely extraordinary. I recommend it to you. I tried to fish up this morning the map that Roosevelt sitting, now think of this, Frank Turner, the head of the Highway Administration, sitting at a table with the President of the United States, drawing lines across a map of the America. And there's a map that I've held in my hand of 3 blue lines across America and 4 blue lines north-south, done by Roosevelt. Not smart enough to know that if you do blue lines, you can't Xerox them, you know, so the man just had no vision. Anyway, as the interstate era came to a close, back late 80s, no new vision emerged to replace it. Nothing with the interstate's power, the power to attract interest and support, or the power to repel nice people wanting to do good things with the money, came into its place. And so we ended up with a very, very rich funding system without a goal. So a source of revenue without a goal in Washington is, you know, like chumming the ocean for sharks. Let me tell you that the federal gasoline tax per penny throws off $1.7 billion. Every penny, $1.7 billion. Think about that. I mean, that kind of money attracts sharks. And that's what the system is all about. And all the discussions you hear about economic theory comes down to who gets that money and where does it go. The result of all of these things, I think, is a real lack of focus, great expansions in the program's eligibility, you know, doing great transportation museums, all kinds of neat stuff, a grant program fundamentally, and earmarks. Ronald Reagan vetoed the legislation because it had, what, 7 earmarks, Ron, and 17 earmarks, and now we have less than, what, 6,000? And that's the one we know about. I mean, there's others buried in there. We're now into this post-interstate era. We've gone through 3 6-year cycles. The next cycle begins next year. It's going to be very, very ugly. So I don't know, maybe it's either going to be the Congress continuing to temporize, proving that there's no problem so big that they can't run away from it, or maybe it will launch the new era, the new post-interstate era. I don't know what it's going to be called. We did a study for the National Academy on the next interstate, and I won't discuss it here today, simply to let you know that we have looked at the next round of interstate needs out the next 35 years and looking at the scale of what needs to be done, and you can see some of the indicators here, but I just wanted you to know that there are people actually thinking about that stuff and trying to hold user costs stable out into the future. The Federal Highway Trust Fund, I don't expect you to read this chart, but those big red circles basically tell you when the Highway Trust Fund and the Transit Trust Fund go insolvent. The Congress didn't so much care that they went insolvent as long as they went insolvent the day after the legislation stops. Unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be several months before the legislation, and then now they're forced to deal with it. They're forced to address it. And it'll be just great fun watching them squirm and figure out how they're going to get through that. Transit goes insolvent later, not because they're better at it, but simply because they tend to spend money slower. It takes longer to get a transit program spent. So we have this immense set of infrastructure issues, a relatively more operable future in my view, and yet we have this immense backlog. We have a retrofitting of the system that's required. We have an interstate reconstruction process. We're familiar, of course, with the Minnesota bridges. About 70% of the interstate bridges were built pre-1970 or early 70s. So there's really a great deal of work to be done. The feds are increasingly an unreliable partner. The last time around, I think we had 12 continuing resolutions before the legislation passed, and this time I'll think it takes 4 years just to get legislation out the door, and absolutely no interest in mobility. The funding is inadequate 2 ways. Obviously, to take care of the backlog. And the second thing is you need a whole bunch of money, about 40% increase in money, just to pay off the players to make legislation work. You've got donors, donees that need to be made happy in order to make this thing work. So we're in a situation, perhaps, of devolution by default. The Congress is not ready for the post-gas tax era. They're very reluctant to go to a fuel tax. They're very reluctant to go to the alternative. They'd like private roles, but they're not quite sure how. We have a couple of study commissions that are trying to help them get through. It's kind of like Tarzan swinging through the jungle, you know, on those great vines. And he's got this one vine that says gas tax that he's afraid to let go of, and that next vine says tolling, and he's not so sure about that one. And so they're really hanging in the jungle in that kind of a concern. So the grass is really always greener on the other horn of the dilemma. And so this, you know, the Congress is literally swinging back and forth in their sense of where the image is. The context has two elements. There's a finance element and a policy element. Sam mentioned some of this before. Inflation, fuel efficiency, new power sources. The real thing, I'm sorry, Sam, the real issue is inflation. If you took care of inflation, you could give the gift of fuel efficiency and new power sources for at least the next 20 years. But all of that decay in real value is a product of inflation and the cost of inflation. On the policy side, there's a great interest in market signals, private sector economic concepts, all of the things that we've been talking about here this morning. I characterize it as two different views going on in Washington, clearly characterized by the commissions. The one I call the tabula rasa school of public policy. This is where they really think it's great that the gas tax is going to die because we can finally get it right. And then the other side is called the creeping incrementalists who say, where is all this going and why can't we just slow down? The TR school sees this whole thing as an opportunity to get things right, hot lanes, variable pricing, system-wide tolling. The CI school sees a lot more proof is needed. They see it as complementary, not as a replacement, not a substitute. They want to protect the present tax base, and they are very concerned about the cash qualification of tolling. And they can take the money away from you in tolling just as fast as they can take it away from you in the gas tax. And so people will think of good things to do, and we're already seeing that. People selling off a piece of their toll revenue in order to get something. So we have this national conflict, really, colossal issues in my mind. What role for tolling? Who plans? How? How do we determine new capacity needs? Who sets the prices? Prices with what intent? It scares me that the leaders in this game are all from Portland. I rest my case. Who gets the money for what? Dedication versus general revenue is one of the great issues. I can very simply see, and I had a slide that I often use here, the debate going on in the EU. The belief is that toll revenues are general revenue and should go into the general fund. And once you start that game, you're talking about the European system of $7 a gallon gasoline plus tolls. So why can't there be an end to all this killing? Why can't there be peace in the valley? This is Walter Brennan. You may remember him saying that just about every flick he ever made. And I'm trying to propose some boundaries, some relationship where we can get the tollers to talk to the taxers. Very long story here, but basically toll roads have a very long effective history. We're in the third wave of tolling in America. Great strength is simply that users pay, non-users don't. Great way to get at high-quality premium service. But there are certainly weaknesses. There's an old virtuous circle between the bondholders, the user, and the system operator that keeps that thing in balance. And when you break that, it gets very distressing to me. Many taxpayers don't like toll roads any better than they like gas taxes. They just don't like paying for stuff. The gas tax generates a colossal amount of money, as I mentioned. The gas tax is currently diminished by fuel efficiency gains, shifts to fuels, other kinds, mostly by inflation. The public and their elected officials don't like gas taxes any more than they like tolls. Thank you. Some adjustment mechanisms, like an inflation adjustment, perhaps a fuel efficiency adjustment, could keep the tax going. Historically, we've had these fights all the time about the system's broken, we have to fix it. Then the Congress passes a 10-cent a gallon gas tax, everybody goes home and spends the money, and we forget about it. Every once in a while, we get in trouble again, and we start talking about, well, what is the real purpose? How do we come up with an economic system? But to me, the main point here is to lose the gas tax, to have it diverted to some other federal or state interest would be a disaster of exceptional order for transportation. Not just in revenues, but in the potential that others would obtain to manipulate ground transportation. I was in Europe and it's $7 a gallon. And that's for doing good work. You heard the gentleman from England saying that they get, what, 20% back of what they put into the program? They pay the government 5 times as much as they get back. It's not that they don't get as much money as we do for our roads. They do. But somebody taxes them 5 times as much as what they get. That's the real message. The federal gasoline tax puts an upper limit on what you can spend as long as it's dedicated to the system. So I think there really could be peace in the valley if we simply agreed that the gas tax and tolling concepts are complementary. The basic gas tax approach can significantly benefit from greater emphasis on tolling. Great opportunities exist. Toll roads can't do it alone. They are a useful supplement, but cannot approach meeting the basic needs of the system. Think of paying off the reconstruction of Montana. Protecting toll roads revenue from diversion is as important as protecting the gas tax from diversion. Mechanisms really need to be put in place that support the continued effectiveness and strengths of these two very fundamental revenue sources. So this is kind of my agenda: defend the Highway Trust Fund's role, defend the program from further diffusion, defend it from other neat things that people can think of to do. There's a wonderful opera house that we need to build. Assure a supportive rational tolling policy where they're dedicated to facilities, where they're seen as revenue tools, not as social engineering. It would not be the first time that sound economic theory was corrupted by the political process. I've seen it too many times. I've been around too long. So I suggest that we kind of remember this sequence of credibility, vision, plan, finance, and I hope that will help us out into the future. Winning public respect and support, demonstrating real dedication to solving congestion, adopting measurable performance results, and accepting public consumer sovereignty. So my ringing close here is the time for action is past, ladies and gentlemen. Now is the time for senseless bickering. Thank you.
Good.